Ryan Walker rose from his chair before the deaf woman had crossed even half the restaurant. Every head at that long table turned. His ex-wife's smile froze on her face. And then, in front of 40 people who'd come to watch him crumble, Ryan lifted his hands and signed, clean and certain. "I'm glad you came. I hope the drive wasn't hard." The whole room went dead silent, because Lauren had planned this night to break him. She'd invited every old friend they'd ever shared just to watch him squirm. What she never knew was that the joke she'd arranged had already turned into the beginning of the end for her. Before this story is over, someone at that table loses everything. If you want to know who stay with me all the way to the finish. And do me a favor, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments, so I can see how far this story travels tonight. If you believe a quiet man's dignity is worth more than a loud woman's laughter, hit that subscribe button and follow along. Let's begin. Ryan Walker was standing in his kitchen at 6:14 on a Friday evening holding his phone, the way a man holds something he already suspects is going to hurt him. "Ryan?" Lauren's voice came through smooth as glass. "It's me." He didn't answer right away. He'd learned in 8 years of marriage and 11 months of divorce that the silence unnerved her more than anything he could say. "I know it's been a while," she said. "I've been thinking about you." "Have you?" It wasn't a question. He kept his eyes on the stove where a pot of macaroni was going soft for his daughter's dinner. "Don't be like that. I'm trying to do something nice for once." A little laugh. "You always assume the worst about me." "I've had practice," Ryan said. There was a pause, and he could picture her exactly the way she'd press her lips together, the way she'd tilt her head like she was talking to a stubborn child. Lauren Mitchell had a face that could make a jury believe anything. "Look," she said. "There's a restaurant downtown, Bellamy's. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. I want to introduce you to someone." "Introduce me to someone." "A woman. Ryan, she's lovely. I think you two would really hit it off. God knows you need to get out of that apartment and start living again." Ryan turned off the burner. In the next room, he could hear the small, absurdly loud footsteps of his 6-year-old Sophie thundering back and forth in a game only she understood. "Why would you do that for me?" he said. "Because I feel bad." "Okay, is that so hard to believe?" "I feel bad about how things ended, and I want to see you happy." Her voice dropped into something warmer, more intimate, the voice she used to get her way. "Just come. One dinner. If you don't like her, you never have to see her again. But at least give it a shot. For me. For me." 2 words that had cost him more of his life than any other combination of syllables in the English language. Ryan should have said no. Every instinct in his body honed by 12 years in the Navy and a childhood that taught him to read a room before he entered it told him something was wrong. Lauren did not do favors. Lauren did not feel bad. Lauren, in all the years he'd known her, had never once done a single thing that didn't circle back to Lauren. But there was another voice too, a quieter one. A voice that said, "You've been alone in this apartment for 11 months. You get up, you feed the kid, you drive to the warehouse, you drive to the second job, you come home, you fall asleep in a chair. Maybe you should get out. Maybe you should try." "What's her name?" he said. He could hear the smile snap back into Lauren's voice. "Emily. Her name is Emily. You're going to love her, Ryan. Trust me." "Trust me." He almost laughed. 7 o'clock, he said. "Bellamy's." 7 o'clock. Oh, and Ryan wear something nice, not the flannel. For once. The line went dead before he could answer. Ryan set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a long moment listening to his daughter play. "Daddy, is macaroni ready?" Sophie appeared in the doorway with her hair in the crooked ponytail he'd tied that morning. One sock on, one sock off, holding a stuffed rabbit missing an eye. "Almost peanut. 2 minutes." "Who was on the phone?" Ryan crouched down to her level, because that was a thing he'd promised himself he would always do. Get down to her height, look her in the eye, treat her words like they mattered. His own father had never once done that. "That was Mom," he said. Sophie's face did something complicated. She was 6, but she wasn't stupid. Kids never are. "Is she coming over?" "No, baby. She just wanted to talk to me about a grown-up thing." "Oh." She hugged the rabbit tighter. "Are you sad?" And that right there, that question from a 6-year-old, was the reason Ryan Walker got up every single morning. "No," he said, and he meant it. "I'm not sad. I've got the best girl in the whole world eating macaroni with me tonight. How could I be sad?" She giggled. He pulled her into a hug, and over the top of her head, he stared at the wall and thought about Lauren's voice and the word lovely and the thing in his gut that would not sit still. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Ryan sat in the dark and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He held up his hands, and slowly, in the empty living room, he began to sign. Words with no one to receive them. "Hello. My name is Ryan. It's good to meet you. How are you feeling today?" His fingers were stiff out of practice, clumsy in a way that shamed him. There'd been a time when he could sign faster than most men could talk. He'd learned it in a hospital in Germany, sitting across from a 19-year-old kid named Marcus, who'd lost his hearing to an IED and lost most of his will to live along with it. Ryan had spent 3 months learning American Sign Language, one letter at a time, so that the kid would have anyone to talk to. He'd sat by that bed and signed until his hands ached, telling stupid jokes, describing the weather, arguing about football teams, doing whatever it took to keep a scared kid tethered to the world. Marcus lived. Marcus went home. And Ryan came home too, carrying a language most people never knew he had. Lauren had found it useless. "Why do you keep doing that with your hands when you talk to yourself?" she'd asked once early in the marriage, watching him practice at the kitchen table. "Keeping it sharp," he'd said. "You lose it if you don't use it." "But there's nobody around who's deaf. It's kind of a waste, isn't it? Like learning to fly a plane you'll never own." And so one small piece at a time, he'd stopped. Because that was what he did around Lauren. He made himself smaller, quieter, easier to live with, until there was almost nothing of the original man left. He didn't even notice it happening. That was the terrible part. You don't feel yourself disappearing. You just wake up one day and realize you can't remember the last time you felt like you. Ryan lowered his hands. Tomorrow night. Bellamy's. 7 o'clock. He should have known. Looking back, he did know somewhere underneath everything. But a man who's been alone long enough will walk into a trap just to feel the warmth of the bait. The next evening, Ryan stood outside Bellamy's at 6:52 in the one good jacket he owned, watching his own reflection in the glass. Through the window, he could see the private dining room Lauren had reserved. And what he saw made him stop cold on the sidewalk. It wasn't a table for two. It was a long table, 15, maybe 20 people. And Ryan knew every single face. There was Dave Pruitt, who used to be his friend before the divorce, before everyone chose sides. There was Karen Lauren's sister, who'd never liked him. There was the whole crowd from the old barbecues, the old Christmas parties, the whole social ecosystem that had quietly, thoroughly frozen him out the second Lauren decided he was the villain of her story. And there at the head of the table, holding court with a glass of white wine, was Lauren. She looked magnificent. That was the cruelest thing about her, she always looked magnificent. She'd dressed for an event. Because that's exactly what this was to her. An event. A show. Ryan stood on that sidewalk and understood all at once and completely what was about to happen. She's not setting you up on a date. She's setting you up as the entertainment. Every cell in his body told him to walk. Get in the truck. Drive home. Kiss your daughter. Forget these people ever existed. That was the smart move. The safe move. The move that protected what was left of his dignity. But Ryan Walker had spent 12 years running toward the things other men ran away from. He'd jumped out of helicopters into black water. He'd pulled men out of wreckage that was still on fire. And something in him, something old and stubborn and Navy to the bone, refused to let Lauren Mitchell see him run. You want a show? He thought. Fine. He opened the door and walked in. The temperature of the room changed the moment they saw him. "Ryan?" Lauren rose from her chair, arms open, her voice pitched loud enough to carry to every corner. "You made it. Everyone look who's here." A ripple of greetings, thin and false. Dave gave him a nod that didn't reach his eyes. Karen looked at him the way you look at a stain on the carpet. There was laughter somewhere down the table, quickly hushed, the kind of laughter that lets you know you walked in on a joke about yourself. Have a seat," Lauren said, steering him toward a chair she'd clearly chosen right in the middle, the most visible spot at the table, a seat with an empty chair beside it. The stage. "Big group," Ryan said evenly, sitting down. "Thought this was dinner." "It is dinner," Lauren beamed. "I just thought, why not make a night of it? Get the old crew back together. And I wanted everyone to meet Emily when she gets here. She's running a little late, poor thing." A pause, and then with a flick of her eyes around the table. "She has some trouble with things, directions and all that." A few knowing smiles. Ryan caught them. He filed them away. "What's Emily do?" he asked. "Oh, she's an artist," Lauren said, and the word came out with just the faintest curl of condescension. "She paints. She's very sweet. Very special." Another loaded pause. Karen actually snorted into her wine. Ryan folded his hands on the table and said nothing. He'd learned long ago that silence is a weapon most people are too uncomfortable to face. Give them enough of it and they'll fill it with the truth. Dave leaned over, lowering his voice to something that wasn't quiet enough. "So Lauren tells us this girl's got a condition. That right?" "Does she?" Ryan said. "Yeah, she's—" Dave glanced at Lauren, who gave the smallest nod, granting permission. "She's deaf, man. Can't hear a thing. Lauren figured, you two would have a lot in common." He grinned. "On account of you never talk much either." And there it was, the whole shape of the trap laid bare. She found a deaf woman. She thinks she found a deaf woman. She thinks she's going to sit me across from a woman I can't communicate with in front of every person who ever doubted me and watch me flounder. Watch me get red in the face. Watch me not know what to do with my hands or my words. She wants these people to see the awkward, broken, silent man she's been telling them about for a year. She wants Emily to be the punchline. She wants both of us to be the punchline. Ryan felt something happen in his chest. Not anger exactly. Anger was hot and stupid, and it made you do things you regretted. This was colder than anger, cleaner. It was the feeling he used to get right before a mission went loud, the moment when the fear burned off and left nothing but absolute crystalline clarity. "That's thoughtful of her," Ryan said quietly. "Lauren always did like to plan things out." Lauren, catching only the words and not the tone, positively glowed. "I do," she said. "Somebody has to." Down the table, the wine kept flowing. The volume kept rising. Ryan sat in the middle of it, the guest of honor at his own humiliation, and he waited. He thought about Marcus in that hospital bed. He thought about his hands stiff and out of practice in an empty living room the night before. He thought about a woman named Emily, who had no idea right now that she was driving into a room full of people who'd already decided she was a joke. And something protective and furious rose up in him, not for himself. For her. For a stranger he hadn't even met yet. Because Ryan Walker knew what it was to be the thing people laughed at before you even walked in the door. He knew it in his bones. You're not going to laugh at her, he thought, looking around at all those smug, familiar faces. Not tonight. Not on my watch. "Ted, you know," Lauren said, holding the table's attention the way she always did. "I have to say, Ryan, I'm proud of you for coming. I really am. After everything you know with the—" She waved a hand vaguely. "The difficulties. It shows growth." "The difficulties," Ryan repeated. "You know what I mean. You were never exactly Mr. Social." She smiled around the table, inviting them in. "Remember the Hendersons' party?" He stood in the corner the entire night. 3 hours. I had to make excuses for him. Laughter. Real this time. "Somebody had to watch the door," Ryan said mildly. "Never know who's coming in." "See? See?" Lauren laughed, delighted, taking it as proof of his oddity rather than what it was. This is what I lived with, always on guard, always so serious. I used to say, Ryan, we're at a barbecue, not a war zone. More laughter. Dave clapped Ryan on the shoulder like they were in on it together. Ryan let it roll off him. He'd been shot at. This was nothing, but he noticed something. He noticed that not everyone at the table was laughing. Down at the far end, a young woman he half recognized, a friend of Karen's, maybe wasn't smiling at all. She was watching Ryan with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something like discomfort. Something like the beginning of doubt. Good, he thought. At least one of you is paying attention. How's the little one? Karen asked in the tone of someone lobbing a grenade dressed up as a question. Sophie Wright bet it's hard. A man raising a girl all by himself. She's the best thing in my life, Ryan said simply. Every day. That landed differently than Karen intended. The table quieted a half degree. Even Lauren's smile flickered, because Sophie was a subject Lauren did not like to linger on. Sophie, who lived with Ryan. Sophie, who Lauren saw 2 weekends a month and often canceled. Sophie, whose existence in Ryan's full-time care told a story about the divorce that Lauren had worked very hard to keep everyone from hearing. Well, Lauren said, moving them briskly past it. I'm sure Emily will be here Oh, there she is. Every head at the table turned toward the entrance, and Ryan Walker turned too. Emily Carter stepped through the door of Bellamy's, and the first thing Ryan noticed was that she was terrified. Not shaking, not obvious about it, she held herself with a careful, practiced composure, the kind you build over a lifetime of walking into rooms where you can't hear what people are saying about you. But he could see it, in the set of her shoulders, in the way her eyes swept the table, cataloging faces, reading the room the only way she could visually, instantly, completely. She was 30 maybe. Dark hair pulled back. A dress she'd clearly chosen with care, the way you dress when you want to make a good impression on someone you're hoping might actually see you. There was paint under one of her fingernails. A tiny fleck of blue she'd missed. And something about that fleck of blue undid Ryan a little. She'd tried. She'd gotten dressed up and driven across the city and walked into a room full of strangers hoping. And she was walking into a joke. She didn't know yet. But she would. In about 10 seconds, when nobody quite met her eyes, when the smiles turned smirky, when Lauren said something loud and slow and demeaning, she'd know. She'd feel it the way she'd surely felt it 1,000 times before. That specific isolating cruelty of being the only one in the room who can't hear the laughter but can absolutely feel it. Ryan watched her scan the table. He watched her find Lauren, who was rising with an exaggerated pantomime wave, hello, welcome mouth, moving too wide, gesturing too big, the way people do when they've decided a deaf person is essentially a child. And Ryan watched Emily's face do the thing he knew it would do. That tiny, heartbreaking flinch, that flicker of understanding. She knows, he thought. She just walked in, and she already knows. Lauren turned toward the table, grinning, and Ryan saw her draw breath to say something. He saw the whole thing coming, the loud, condescending introduction, the theatrical over-enunciation, the little aside to the crowd. He saw the punchline loading in her throat. And Ryan Walker decided, in that half-second, that it was not going to happen. Not tonight. Not to this woman. He stood up. He stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped hard against the floor, loud enough that heads turned toward him now, instead of her. Lauren's mouth was still open. Whatever she'd been about to say died there. Ryan, Lauren said. What are you? But Ryan wasn't looking at Lauren. He wasn't looking at Dave or Karen, or any of the 15 faces waiting to be entertained. He was looking at Emily. Only at Emily. He held her gaze steady, warm, direct, the way almost no one ever looked at her, and he lifted his hands. And he signed. I'm glad you came. His fingers moved slower than they used to, but they moved true. Every eye in that room was on his hands now, and not one person there, not Lauren, not Dave, not a single soul at that long table understood a word he was saying, but Emily did. I hope the drive wasn't hard, he signed. You found the place. That's the hardest part. For a moment, Emily didn't move. She just stared at his hands like she couldn't believe they were real, like she'd walked into a room expecting the same thing she always got, and instead the universe had handed her something impossible. Her eyes filled. And then slowly, her own hands came up. "You sign." She signed back, and even in the language of the hands, Ryan could feel the tremor in it. "You actually sign." "I do," he answered. "Please, sit. I saved you the good seat." He pulled out the chair beside his own, the empty chair Lauren had placed there as part of the trap, and gestured to it with a small, unhurried smile. The restaurant had gone completely silent, not the polite hush of people waiting for a joke. This was different. This was the silence of 15 people watching something happen that they did not have the framework to understand. This was the silence of a room realizing all at once that the story they'd been told about the quiet broken man in the flannel might not be the true story after all. Lauren stood frozen at the head of the table, wine glass halfway to her lips, her whole face rearranging itself around a fact she could not process. He can talk to her. He can talk to her, and I can't. The one thing I was sure he couldn't do, the entire point of tonight, and he can do it better than anyone in this room. Emily walked to the chair. She sat down beside Ryan, and as she settled in, her eyes never left his hands, hungry for the next word, because it had been so long. Maybe never since a stranger had greeted her in her own language, with dignity, with warmth, in front of a room full of people who'd expected her to be the punchline. Ryan sat back down next to her. And under the table low, where the others couldn't see it, framed as a performance, he signed one more thing. Just for her. "Whatever's happening here tonight, you and I are the only two people who matter at this table. Okay?" Emily let out a breath that was half a laugh and half something much bigger. She signed back. "Okay, Chung." Down the table, Dave leaned toward Lauren and muttered, "Wait, he knows sign language since when?" Lauren didn't answer. Her jaw had gone tight. "Lauren," Karen hissed, "did you know he could do that?" "No," Lauren said too quietly. "No, he never." But she stopped because the truth was worse than not knowing. The truth was that she had known. Somewhere years ago, in a life she'd stopped paying attention to, she'd watched him practice at a kitchen table, and she'd called it a waste. She'd called it learning to fly a plane he'd never own. She had held the most extraordinary thing about this man in her hands, and she had thrown it away because it didn't serve her. And now it was sitting 3 feet away from her, alive and glowing, aimed at another woman. Lauren Mitchell had built this entire evening: the reservation, the guest list, the seating, the wine, the careful sprinkling of gossip as a monument to Ryan's inadequacy. She had invited every person she needed to witness his smallness. She had spent a week imagining the look on his face when he realized he couldn't speak to the woman across from him. Instead, she was watching him bloom. She had, without meaning to, without any idea what she was doing, reached out into the whole city and found the one woman on earth who could see the man Lauren had spent 8 years refusing to see. She had handed Ryan the exact thing he'd been starving for. She had built a stage for his humiliation, and instead built it for his return. "This isn't—" Lauren started and stopped. She set her wine down. Her hand was not quite steady. Across the table, that young woman at the far end, Karen's friend, the one who hadn't been laughing, was watching Ryan and Emily with her hand pressed lightly to her chest. And when she spoke softly, almost to herself, but the room was quiet enough now that it carried. "That," she said, "is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Nobody laughed. Nobody at that entire long table laughed. Emily reached for the menu and then hesitated, and Ryan saw the flicker of the old fear cross her face. The fear of the waiter, of the ordering of the small daily humiliations that hearing people never even think about. He caught her eye. "I've got you," he signed. "Whatever you want, you tell me, I'll handle it. You don't have to do anything you don't feel like doing tonight." Emily looked at him for a long moment, and then she signed something that Ryan would remember for the rest of his life. "Do you have any idea," she signed slowly, "how long it's been since someone said that to me?" Ryan held her gaze. And under the low light of Bellamy's in the middle of a trap that had sprung shut on the wrong person entirely, he answered her honestly. "Yeah," he signed. "I think I might." Because he did. He knew exactly. He knew what it was to sit at a table full of people who'd already decided who you were. He knew what it was to be the quiet one, the strange one, the one they made excuses for. He knew what it was to have the best part of yourself called a waste by the person who was supposed to love you most. He and Emily had walked into this restaurant from opposite directions. Strangers, both of them delivered here as props in Lauren Mitchell's cruel little play. And in the space of 90 seconds, they had found in each other the one thing neither of them had felt in years. They had been seen. Lauren cleared her throat loud, trying to reclaim the room. "Well," she said, with a brightness that had gone brittle at the edges. "Isn't this just lovely? Ryan, you didn't tell me you knew all that hand business." Ryan turned his head and looked at his ex-wife, really looked at her. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no old ache. He looked at Lauren the way you look at a house you used to live in. Driving past years later, surprised it ever seemed so big. "You never asked," he said. Just that. 3 words. Quiet level without a trace of cruelty in them, which somehow made them land harder than any insult could have. "You never asked." Lauren opened her mouth, closed it. Around the table, her carefully assembled audience had gone still and watchful, and she could feel it. She could feel the current in the room turning against her. Could feel the whole evening. She'd engineered slipping out of her control. Could feel the terrible dawning awareness that she had spent a year telling these people a story, and that the story was right now in front of all of them, quietly falling apart. Ryan turned back to Emily. He didn't need to defend himself. He didn't need to win an argument or make a speech or put Lauren in her place. He just needed to do the thing he was already doing. He needed to see this woman and let himself be seen. "They're all staring at us," Emily signed with the ghost of a smile. "Let them," Ryan signed back. "Best show they'll ever get." And Emily Carter laughed, a real open, unguarded laugh, the kind she almost never let out in front of strangers. And for one suspended moment in a room that had been built to break both of them, the 2 loneliest people at the table were the only ones who weren't alone. Lauren watched them from the head of the table, her wine going warm and forgotten in her hand, and somewhere deep beneath all her careful planning, a cold understanding began to spread through her chest. She had wanted everyone to see Ryan fail. Instead, she had shown them exactly what she'd thrown away. And the worst part, the part that would keep her up that night, and the night after that, was the look on his face. Not triumph, not revenge, just a man quietly, completely at peace, talking with his hands to a woman who understood him in a language his ex-wife had once called a waste of time. The plates hadn't even arrived yet. The night was young. 15 people sat around a table that had been set for a comedy and turned without warning into something none of them had come prepared to witness. And Ryan Walker, former Navy rescue specialist, single father. The quiet man they'd all agreed to feel sorry for, sat in the middle of it, with his hands still moving, saying the kind of true and gentle things to Emily that he hadn't said out loud to anyone in years. And for the first time since the divorce, since long before the divorce, since a version of himself he'd almost forgotten existed, he felt like a man who had finally come home. The waiter came around with the wine list, and Lauren seized on him like a woman grabbing a life preserver. "We'll do another bottle of the Sancerre," she announced loud, taking back the floor. "And has everyone decided? Let's order. Let's not keep the kitchen waiting." She was working hard now, harder than she'd worked all night, trying to steer the evening back onto the rails she'd laid for it. "Emily, honey." She leaned across the table, voice going slow and enormous hands making big, helpless gestures. "Do you want something to eat food?" "Yes." Ryan watched Emily's face close like a door. He'd seen that particular look before on the faces of the deaf soldiers. He'd known the flat, protective blankness a person puts on when someone starts talking to them like they're stupid. It was a kind of armor. You learned to wear it young, and you never fully took it off. "Lauren," Ryan said quietly, "I'm just trying to help her order. She reads menus. She reads lips better than you'd believe. and she can hear the tone in your voice even if she can't hear the words. He said it evenly, without heat. You don't have to shout. You just have to look at her when you talk. The table had gone quiet again. Lauren's cheeks colored. I am looking at her. You're looking at me, Ryan said. You've been looking at me this whole time, talking about her like she's not here. He turned to Emily and signed small and quick. She wants to know if you'd like to order. You can point to anything. Or tell me and I'll do it. Emily's eyes flicked over the menu. Then she looked up, not at Lauren, but directly at the waiter, a young man who'd been standing there uncertain. And she pointed at an item on the menu, and then she pointed at herself, and she said in a voice that was soft and a little unshaped, the way voices are when their owner has never heard them, but perfectly clear, this one, please. The waiter blinked. The roasted chicken. Emily nodded once. She'd read his lips. Thank you, she said. Of course. Great choice. And the young man smiled at her, a real smile, and wrote it down, and moved on to the next person, and the whole small transaction had taken 12 seconds, and there had been nothing pitiable about it at all. Ryan looked at Lauren. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The point had made itself. Down the table, Karen's friend, the young woman who'd called it the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, spoke up. I'm Rachel, by the way, she said, and she was looking at Emily when she said it, and she lifted her hand in a little wave. It's really nice to meet you. Emily smiled at her, a genuine one. She waved back, and just like that, one more person at that table had crossed over. Ryan could feel it happening the way you can feel the tide turn if you've spent enough time in the water. The story Lauren had spent a year building, poor Lauren, married to that cold, strange, silent man, was coming apart in real time, and every gentle, ordinary thing Ryan did was another crack in it. Lauren felt it too. He could see her feeling it, and a cornered Lauren Ryan knew from long experience was a dangerous Lauren. So, Emily, Lauren said, changing tactics, her smile sharpening. How did you and how did we get connected again? Remind everyone, it's such a funny story. Emily looked at Ryan for the translation. He gave it to her, keeping his face neutral, though he already didn't like where this was going. Emily signed her answer, and Ryan translated aloud evenly. She says a mutual friend gave you her number, someone from a community art class. You told her you knew a nice man who was recently single, and you thought the two of you might get along. That's right, Lauren said brightly. That's exactly what I said. She looked around the table, gathering her audience, and Ryan saw the trapdoor open beneath the words. I just thought, Ryan's had such a hard time connecting with people. Always so shut down. So in his own world. And I thought, well, maybe someone who's a little bit in her own world too. They might understand each other. There it was. The cruelty dressed up as kindness. You two belong together because you're both damaged. She'd said it to Emily's face in front of everyone, and she was smiling the whole time as if it were a compliment. For a second, the old fury rose up in Ryan, hot and blinding. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to tell these people exactly what he thought of them. He wanted to take Emily's hand and walk out of this restaurant and never look back. But he didn't. Because he looked at Emily, and he saw that she had understood every word. Read off Lauren's lips, absorbed and comprehended, and he saw the flash of hurt cross her face. And then he saw something else. He saw her jaw set. He saw her sit up a little straighter. She lifted her hands and signed fast. Now her expression fierce, and Ryan felt his heart kick against his ribs as he translated for the table. She says, Ryan started and then stopped and looked at Emily. You want me to say all of that out loud? To all of them. Emily looked back at him, steady as stone. Every word she signed. They wanted a show. Let's give them a good one. And Ryan Walker felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for years because this woman, this stranger, this artist with a fleck of blue paint under her fingernail, had walked into a room built to break her and had decided instead to fight. All right, he said softly, and then louder to the table. She wants me to translate this, so I'm going to. He kept his eyes on Emily's hands and he spoke her words in a clear, level voice that carried to every corner of the room. She says, "I've been deaf since I was 3 years old. I've had my whole life to learn what it looks like when someone thinks I'm less than them. I can see it in the face, in the hands, in the way the mouth moves too slow like I'm a child." The table had gone dead silent. "You think you did a cruel thing tonight bringing me here? You think you're clever, but I want you to understand something." Emily's hands kept moving, and Ryan kept pace with them, his voice never wavering. "You didn't bring me here to a broken man. You brought me here to the first person in this entire room who looked me in the eye and spoke to me like a human being. So thank you. You wanted to embarrass someone tonight, but all you did was introduce me to the kind of man I stopped believing existed." Emily lowered her hands. Nobody spoke. Lauren's face had gone white, then red. Her mouth opened and closed. Dave was staring down at the tablecloth. Karen had put her wineglass down, and Rachel at the far end had tears standing in her eyes. "Well," Lauren said finally, and her voice had a crack in it now, a real crack. That's very dramatic. She's twisting what I meant. I never said anyone was broken." "You said it in the parking lot last week," a voice cut in. Everyone turned. It was Dave. Dave Pruitt, Ryan's old friend, the one who'd nodded at him without warmth, the one who'd leaned over and made the crack about Ryan not talking much. He was looking at Lauren now, and something in his expression had shifted. "You told me the whole plan, Lauren," Dave said slowly. You said you were going to set him up with a deaf girl and watch him sweat. You said it'd be funny. You said he wouldn't know what to do with himself." Dave looked over at Ryan, and there was shame in his face now. Real shame. "I went along with it. That was wrong. I'm sorry, man. That was a wrong thing to do." The silence after that was so total that Ryan could hear the kitchen doors swinging somewhere in the back. Lauren stood up. "I don't know what this is being blown completely out of." She was flustered now, genuinely flustered, the polish gone. "It was a dinner. I invited some friends to a dinner. If Ryan wants to make it into some big emotional thing," she gestured wildly at him, at Emily, at the whole table, "then that's exactly the problem. That's exactly what I dealt with for 8 years. Everything's always so heavy, so serious, so—" "Lauren." Ryan's voice was very quiet, and it stopped her cold. He stood up too, but he didn't stand up angry. He stood up slow and calm, and he buttoned the one good jacket he owned, and he looked at his ex-wife across the wreckage of the evening she'd planned. "I'm not going to fight with you," he said. "I've done enough of that to last a lifetime. You want to know the truth. 6 months ago, this night would have destroyed me. 6 months ago, I'd have sat here and taken it and gone home and stared at the ceiling and believed every word you said about me. Because that's what I did for 8 years. I believed you." He paused. "That was my mistake. Not yours. Mine." Lauren stared at him. "But something happened tonight that you didn't plan for," Ryan went on. "Somebody looked at me tonight, really looked, and reminded me who I was before I met you. And I'm not going to let you take that away by turning this into another fight." He picked up his napkin, folded it, set it on the table. "So, here's what's going to happen. Emily and I are going to finish our dinner somewhere else, and you and your friends can have your party. And I hope I mean this. I hope someday you figure out why you needed to do this. Because a person who's happy doesn't spend a week planning a night like this. A happy person just lives their life." He turned to Emily and signed, "Would you like to get out of here? I know a place. Quieter. Better food. Nobody staring." Emily was already standing. "I thought you'd never ask," she signed. Ryan pulled her chair back for her. Not because she needed it, but because it was a kind thing to do, and because he wanted every person at that table to see one man treat one woman with plain, unhurried respect. He held out his arm. Emily took it, and the two of them walked the length of that long table, past Karen, past the friends who wouldn't meet his eyes, past Dave, who gave him a small, ashamed nod, past Rachel, who whispered, "It was so nice to meet you," and meant it, And out the door of Bellamy's, into the cool night air, leaving Lauren Mitchell standing alone at the head of a table she'd set for a comedy in a silence louder than any laughter she'd hoped to hear. Outside, the night had that first real cool of early autumn in it, and the streetlights were just coming on, and Ryan Walker stood on the sidewalk and breathed like a man who'd been underwater a long time. Emily let go of his arm and turned to face him so he could see her hands. "That," she signed, "was the strangest first date I have ever been on in my life." And Ryan laughed. He actually laughed out loud from the belly, a sound he hadn't made in longer than he could remember. "I'm so sorry," he signed back. "You have no idea. I'm so sorry you got dragged into that. You didn't deserve any of it. Nobody does." Emily waved the apology away. "You didn't do it," she signed. "She did it. And honestly—" A small smile tugged at her mouth. "I've had worse. You want to know the truth? Most nights I'd have walked in, felt the room turn, and left before the food came. I've done it 100 times. You learn to spot it. The pity table. The pity table," Ryan repeated with his hands. "That's what I call it. When someone invites you somewhere and you realize halfway through you're the entertainment. The brave deaf girl. The inspiration." Her hands moved with a bitter fluency. "You have no idea how tired I am of being somebody's inspiration." "I don't think you're an inspiration," Ryan signed. Emily's eyebrows went up. "I think you're kind of a smartass," he signed. "They wanted a show, let's give them a good one." "Who says that?" And Emily Carter laughed that real open laugh again, the one she kept locked up around strangers, and Ryan thought it might be the best thing he'd heard in years. "Come on," he signed. "I know a diner about 10 minutes from here. Been going there since before the Navy. Cracked vinyl booths. Coffee that could strip paint. The owner's a Vietnam vet named Sal, who yells at everybody and means none of it. You'll like him." "Will he be able to understand me?" "Sal understands everybody. He just pretends he can't hear you so he doesn't have to be nice." Ryan grinned. "You two are going to get along great." Sal's diner was half empty and smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and 40 years of both. And Ryan slid into a corner booth across from Emily and watched her take the place in the old jukebox, the pie case, the hand-lettered specials board with an artist's eyes cataloging colors. And he thought she sees everything. She sees more than most people who can hear. Sal came over himself, a big grizzled man with a limp and an apron that had given up hope years ago. "Walker," he said, "the hell happened to you? You look like somebody ran you over and then backed up to check." "Long night, Sal." Sal's eyes went to Emily. Ryan watched him take in the situation, the way she was watching Sal's mouth. The stillness of her, and Ryan watched an old soldier's instincts kick in. "Ma'am?" Sal said. And he'd slowed down just slightly and turned to face her. Square. And Ryan realized Sal had probably dealt with more than a few deaf and hard-of-hearing veterans over the decades. "You want coffee?" Emily nodded. "Please," she said. "Coming up. And whatever this bum's having, put it on his tab. He can afford it." Sal winked and limped off, and Ryan translated the whole exchange, and Emily was smiling. "I like him," she signed. "Told you." They talked. For 3 hours they talked. Hands moving in the amber light of the diner, coffee going cold, and getting refilled pie appearing that neither of them had ordered because Sal decided they looked like they needed it. And somewhere in those 3 hours, the night stopped being about Lauren at all. "Tell me about the Navy," Emily signed. "You said you learned to sign in the service. That's not a common place to learn." And Ryan told her. He told her about Marcus, the 19-year-old in the hospital bed in Germany, the kid who'd lost his hearing to a roadside bomb and lost his will to live right behind it. He told her how he'd sat by that bed for 3 months, learning the alphabet one clumsy letter at a time, how the first full sentence he ever signed to Marcus was a dirty joke that made the kid laugh so hard a nurse came running. "You saved his life," Emily signed when he'd finished. Ryan shook his head. "No, he saved his own. I just gave him somebody to talk to while he figured out he wanted to keep going. That's all any of us can do for each other, really. Just be there. Be a voice so the quiet doesn't win." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she signed. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone's said to me in a long time, and I didn't even hear it. I saw it." She smiled, "Which I think is better." "Your turn," Ryan signed. "Tell me about the paint under your fingernail." Emily looked down at her hand at the tiny fleck of blue, and she laughed and covered it self-consciously. "You noticed that?" "I notice things," Ryan signed. "Occupational hazard. I was trained to look at everything. Old habit." "It's from a piece I'm working on," Emily signed. "I'm an artist. I paint. Big canvases mostly. Abstract but not random. I paint sound." Ryan tilted his head. "You paint sound. I know how that sounds. Ironic. The deaf girl paints sound." Her hands slowed, and something vulnerable came into her face. "But I don't experience the world as silent. That's what hearing people never get. It's not silence. It's vibration. It's color. It's the way the floor hums when a truck goes by. The way I can feel music in my chest at a concert, even if I can't hear the melody. The way light moves. I've spent my whole life in a world that everyone assumes is empty and quiet, and it's not. It's full. It's so full." Her eyes were bright now. "So I paint it. I try to put on the canvas what the world actually feels like to me, so that maybe for a second a hearing person can see what I see." Ryan Walker looked at this woman across the cracked vinyl booth, and he felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten the shape of it. "I'd like to see your paintings," he signed. "I mean that. Not to be polite. I want to see how the world looks to you." Emily studied his face for a long moment, the way she studied everything, reading past the words to the truth underneath. And whatever she found there, she must have decided she could trust it, because she signed, "Okay, but fair warning. Once you see how I see the world, you can't unsee it. It changes how you look at everything." "Good," Ryan signed. "I could use a change in how I look at things." It was almost midnight when Ryan pulled his truck up outside the little house where the babysitter was watching Sophie, and he cut the engine and sat there for a second in the dark. His phone had 11 missed calls on it, all from Lauren. 3 voicemails he hadn't listened to and didn't intend to. A string of texts that started angry and got angrier. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You made me look like the bad guy. This is exactly what you always do. You turn everything around. You play the victim. I hope your little deaf girlfriend was worth it." Ryan read that last one twice. Your little deaf girlfriend. And he realized sitting there in his truck at midnight that he felt no urge at all to respond. None. For 8 years, a message like that would have hooked him instantly. He'd have fired back, or worse, he'd have gone quiet and stewed and let it eat him alive for days. Lauren had always been able to reach right into his chest and squeeze. But something had shifted tonight. He read the words, "your little deaf girlfriend," and instead of anger, all he felt was a kind of sad, distant clarity. Because he understood finally that Lauren's cruelty had never been about him at all. It was about her. It was the sound a person makes when they've built their whole life on being the most important one in every room, and the room stops looking at them. He turned the phone face down on the seat. Inside the babysitter, a college kid named Maddie from 2 doors down was doing homework at the kitchen table. "She went down around 8:30, Maddie whispered. "Read her 2 books. She wanted 3, but I told her 2. She gathered her things. How was your dinner?" Ryan paid her and thought about the question and gave her the truest answer he had. "Strangest night of my life," he said. "But I think maybe a good one." He walked Maddie to the door, watched her cross the 2 yards to her own house, and then he went upstairs and stood in the doorway of his daughter's room. Sophie was asleep with the one-eyed rabbit under her arm, her crooked ponytail half undone on the pillow, her mouth open a little the way it always was when she was really out. Ryan stood there and looked at her for a long time, the way he did most nights, this small, fierce person, who was the whole reason his heart kept beating. And for the first time in a long time standing in that doorway, he let himself think about the future. He'd spent 11 months just surviving. Get up, Feed the kid, drive to the warehouse, drive to the second job, come home, collapse. Survive the day, survive the next one. He hadn't let himself want anything because wanting things had only ever led to disappointment, and he had a daughter to raise and no room in his life for his own heart. But tonight a woman had looked at him, really looked, and greeted him in a language his ex-wife had called a waste, and for 3 hours in a diner booth he had felt like a whole person again. Not a soldier, not a divorced man, not a single father drowning quietly. Just Ryan. He didn't know what any of it meant yet. He didn't let himself get ahead of it. But he knew one thing standing in that doorway watching his daughter breathe. Something in him had woken up, and it wasn't going back to sleep. The text came 3 days later on a Tuesday, while Ryan was on his lunch break at the warehouse eating a sandwich in the cab of his truck. It was from a number he didn't recognize, and for one bad second he thought it might be Lauren from a new phone. But then he read it. "Hi, it's Emily. Sal gave me your number. I hope that's okay. I told him if you got mad about it to tell you it was his idea. It was not his idea. I made him do it." Ryan smiled at his sandwich. Another text came through. "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to see how the world looks to me. I'm having a small thing at my studio Saturday, a few pieces I've been working on. It's not a real show, just some friends, some wine, some art on the walls. You should come. Bring the coffee that strips paint guy if you want. Bring anyone. And then after a pause, one more. Or don't. No pressure. I just wanted you to know the invitation is real." Ryan set the sandwich down and typed back with 2 thumbs slowly because he wanted to get it right. "I'll be there. What time? And is it okay if I bring my daughter? She's 6. She saw me signing at home last night and she's been trying to copy me all week. I think she'd lose her mind over a room full of paintings." The reply came almost instantly. "Bring your daughter, please. I would love that more than you know. And then 7 p.m. I'll text you the address. And Ryan." Thank you for saying yes. Ryan sat in the cab of his truck in the warehouse parking lot, and he read that last text 3 times, and he found that he was grinning like an idiot alone with mustard on his thumb. He told Sophie that night at dinner. "We're going where—" Sophie's eyes went wide. "To see some paintings. My friend Emily made them. Remember I told you about Emily? The lady I had dinner with. The one who talks with her hands like you. That's the one." Sophie considered this with the deep seriousness that 6-year-olds bring to important matters. "Can she teach me more hands?" "I think she'd love to teach you more hands." "Can I wear my sparkle dress?" "You can wear whatever you want, Peanut." "Daddy," Sophie put down her fork. "Do you like Emily?" And Ryan Walker, who had learned the hard way to always tell his daughter the truth, looked at her across the dinner table and said, "Yeah, I like her. She's kind, and she's smart, and she's funny, and she treats people the right way. That's the most important thing there is, Soph. How somebody treats people. You remember that?" Sophie nodded solemnly, and then because she was 6, she said, "Can we have ice cream?" "After you finish your peas." "That's not fair." "Life's not fair, kid. Eat your peas." And she did, making a face at every single one, and Ryan watched her and thought that he had not felt this light, this ordinary, this okay, in longer than he could remember. Saturday came, and Ryan put on a clean shirt and wrestled Sophie into the sparkle dress and combed her hair as straight as his clumsy hands could manage, and they drove across the city to an address in the old warehouse district, a part of town that artists had colonized because the rent was cheap and the ceilings were high. Emily's studio was on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building, up a freight elevator that Sophie insisted on operating herself, and when the doors rattled open, Ryan Walker stopped breathing for a second. The whole floor was one enormous room, and the walls were covered floor to ceiling, wall to wall, in the biggest, most alive paintings he had ever seen. They weren't quiet. That was the first thing that struck him. Emily painted sound, she'd said, and now he understood because the canvases roared. Great swaths of color that seemed to move, blues that hummed like a bass line, streaks of gold that shot across the surface like a note held too long, deep reds that pulsed like a heartbeat. He didn't have words for what he was looking at. He just knew that it was the inside of somebody's world, and the somebody had let him in. "Daddy," Sophie breathed, gripping his hand. "It's so loud." And Ryan felt his throat tighten, because his 6-year-old had just said without knowing it, the exact right thing. It was loud. It was the loudest quiet he had ever seen. Emily appeared out of the small crowd. There were maybe 15 people there, drinking wine out of plastic cups, and Ryan noticed with a warm ache that several of them were signing to each other that Emily had built herself a world where she was not the odd one out. And when she saw Ryan and Sophie standing in the elevator doorway, her whole face opened up like a window. She came straight to them. She crouched down to Sophie's level. She gets down to her height, Ryan thought, just like I do. And she signed something slow and simple, and then she looked up at Ryan to translate. "Tell her I said, I'm so happy you came. I love your sparkle dress. And do you want to learn a new word?" Ryan told her. Sophie's eyes went enormous. She nodded so hard her ponytail bounced. Emily held up her hands and showed her, and Sophie, tongue between her teeth in concentration, copied it, small clumsy fingers doing their best. "What does it mean?" Sophie asked out loud, and Emily read her lips and understood, and she signed the answer, and Ryan's voice came out rougher than he expected when he translated it. "It means friend," Ryan said. "She taught you friend." And Sophie flung her arms around Emily's neck, sparkle dress and all. And Emily, who could not hear the little girl's laughter, but could feel it humming right against her chest, closed her eyes and held on. Ryan Walker stood in that big loud room full of quiet, and he watched a woman he'd known for 6 days hold his daughter, and he felt the last of something inside him that had been frozen for a very long time finally quietly begin to thaw. The weeks that followed were the kind Ryan Walker had stopped believing were possible for a man like him. They didn't rush anything. That was the thing he kept coming back to, lying awake at night in the quiet of his apartment. Neither of them rushed. Emily had been hurt before he could see the old wariness in her, the way she held a little of herself back, the way she watched him for signs that he'd turn out to be like everyone else. And Ryan had been hurt, too, hollowed out and rebuilt from scratch, and he wasn't about to hand his newly mended heart to someone before he knew for certain she'd be careful with it. So they went slow. Coffee at Sal's. Long conversations in the studio while Emily painted, and Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor learning a new sign every visit. Slow. But slow didn't mean small. Every one of those quiet afternoons was building something brick by brick, and Ryan could feel it going up around him like a house he was finally allowed to live in. Sophie fell in love with Emily first and hardest, the way children do, with no hesitation and no defense. Within a month, the little girl could hold a basic conversation in sign, her small hands flying, correcting her father when he got sloppy. "Daddy, that's not how you do butterfly," she'd say, exasperated, and Emily would laugh her silent, shaking laugh. And Ryan would let his daughter fix him, because there was nothing in the world sweeter than watching Sophie become fluent in the language he'd once let Lauren convince him was a waste. "She's better than me already," Ryan signed to Emily one afternoon watching Sophie practice in the corner. "Children learn it like breathing," Emily signed back. "No fear. That's the whole secret. They're not embarrassed to be bad at something new. We lose that when we grow up. We start protecting ourselves instead of learning." She looked at him, and there was a weight behind the look. "You'd unlearned it too, you know. When I met you, you signed like a man apologizing for it." "I did. Every word. Like you were bracing to be told it was stupid." Her hands softened. "You don't sign like that anymore." And Ryan realized she was right. Somewhere in those weeks, the apology had gone out of his hands. It couldn't last, of course. Peace like that never got to just sit there undisturbed, not in Ryan's experience. And the thing that came for it came as these things do on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in the form of a phone call. Ryan was at the warehouse when his phone buzzed. Lauren's name on the screen. He almost let it go to voicemail, he'd gotten good at that. but some instinct, the same one that had kept him alive in worse places than a warehouse, told him to answer. "Ryan." Her voice was different this time. Not smooth, not sharp. Tight. Controlled in the way people are controlled when they're one wrong word from losing it. "We need to talk. About Sophie." Everything in him went cold and still. "What about her?" "Not on the phone. In person. Tonight." A pause. "It's important, Ryan. It's about custody." He stepped away from the loading dock out into the parking lot where he could hear. "Say that again." "You heard me." And now the old Lauren was back, the one who knew exactly where to put the knife. "I've been talking to a lawyer. I've been thinking a lot since that little scene you made at the restaurant. And I've come to some conclusions about the environment my daughter is being raised in." Ryan's hand tightened on the phone until the plastic creaked. "The environment," he said very quietly. "A father working 2 jobs, never home, leaving her with a teenage babysitter half the nights of the week. And now bringing some woman he's known for a month around her, introducing her to strangers, taking her God knows where. Emily is not a stranger." "She's a stranger to me," Lauren snapped. "And I'm her mother. I have a right to know who's around my child. And I have a right to decide that maybe Sophie would be better off with me. Full time." Ryan stood in the parking lot and felt the world narrow down to a single point of white light. He had faced men with guns. He had jumped into water that would kill you in 4 minutes. He had pulled the burned and the broken out of wreckage. And none of it had ever frightened him the way those 4 words frightened him now. "Better off with me." "You don't want her full time," he said, and his voice came out steady, which surprised him. "You cancel every other weekend. You forgot her birthday. You, Lauren, you have not asked me one single question about her life in 4 months. You don't want Sophie. You want to hurt me. And you found the one way that actually works." There was a silence on the line. "Meet me tonight," Lauren said. 7, the coffee place on 5th. We'll talk. Or don't, and my lawyer files Monday. Your choice." The line went dead. Ryan stood in the parking lot for a long time, phone in his hand, breathing. Then he did the thing he did now. The thing he hadn't been able to do 6 months ago. He didn't spiral. He didn't panic. He drove to the studio and he climbed the freight elevator and he found Emily at her easel with a brush in her hand. And when she turned and saw his face, she put the brush down immediately. "What happened?" she signed. And Ryan told her. Everything. His hands shook as he signed it, and he had to stop twice, and Emily crossed the room and put her hands over his to still them. And then she made him sit down, and she got him water, and she waited until he could look at her. "She wants to take Sophie," he signed finally. "She doesn't even want her. She wants to take her because of us. Because of me being happy. She can't stand it. She would use our daughter as a weapon just to hurt me, and I—" His hand stopped. "I can't lose her, Emily. She's everything. She's the only thing I did right." Emily was quiet for a long moment, and then she signed something that Ryan would carry with him through everything that came after. "Listen to me," she signed, slow and fierce, forcing him to look at her hands. "I have spent my entire life being underestimated. People look at me and they see something less. They see a problem, a limitation. And I have learned the hard way that the people who underestimate you are the easiest people in the world to beat. Because they don't see you coming." Her hands were flying now. "Lauren looks at you and she still sees the quiet, broken man she made up. She thinks you'll fold. She thinks you'll panic and make a mistake. So don't. Don't give her the man she remembers. Give her the one who's sitting in front of me right now." Ryan looked at her. "You are not the man she left," Emily signed. "Show her." Oh. He met Lauren at the coffee place on 5th at 7 o'clock, and he walked in calm, and that alone seemed to unsettle her. She was sitting at a corner table with a manila folder in front of her, a prop he understood immediately meant to intimidate, and she was dressed for war, and she watched him cross the room with an expression that was trying very hard to be confident. He sat down across from her. He didn't touch the folder. He folded his hands on the table, and he waited. "So?" Lauren said when the silence had gone on longer than she liked. You came. You said it was about Sophie. Anything about Sophie, I'll always come. Well. She opened the folder, made a show of it. I've been documenting. The nights you leave her with the babysitter, the second job, the instability, and now this woman. A judge is going to look at all this, Ryan, and they're going to see a child in a chaotic situation with an absent father, and they're going to see a mother with a stable home who works part-time at a boutique and lives in a one-bedroom apartment with a boyfriend she's known for 3 months. Ryan said quietly. Lauren stopped. You think I don't know about Kevin? Ryan said. Soph mentions him. She doesn't like how he talks to you, by the way. A 6-year-old picks up on things. He let that sit for a second. I'm not documenting you, Lauren. I'm not building a folder. Because I don't want to hurt you. I never did. That's the difference between us that you've never been able to understand. Lauren's jaw worked. This isn't about, here's what's going to happen, Ryan said, and his voice never rose, and that steadiness was doing something to her, he could see it. You're not going to file anything on Monday. And you know why? Not because you're afraid of a custody fight. Because you'd lose. You know you'd lose. I have Sophie 90% of the time because you asked me to. You wanted your freedom. You wanted your life back. You told me your words that you weren't cut out to be a full-time mom. I have texts. I have a year of texts, Lauren, where you begged me to keep her the weekends you had plans. The color was draining out of Lauren's face. So no judge is taking her from me, Ryan went on. We both know that. Which means this whole folder, this whole meeting was never really about custody at all, was it? Lauren didn't answer. It was about the restaurant, Ryan said gently now, almost kindly. It was about that night. You planned something to make yourself feel big, and it made you feel small instead, and you've been chasing that feeling ever since, trying to find a way to make me hurt as much as you did. He shook his head slowly. Lauren, I'm not your enemy. I never was. But I'm done being your target. And if you ever use our daughter to get at me again, I will stop being the man who protects you from your own worst instincts. Do you understand what I'm telling you? For a moment, Lauren Mitchell sat across from her ex-husband and could not speak. And then, to Ryan's genuine surprise, her eyes filled. You were never like this, she whispered. When we were married, you never fought back. You just took it. You just went quiet and took it, and I hated you for it. I hated how quiet you were. I hated that I could say anything to you, and you'd just absorb it. Her voice cracked. Where was this man? Where was he for 8 years? And Ryan Walker looked at his ex-wife across a coffee shop table and gave her the truest, hardest thing he knew. You buried him, he said. One day at a time. You told me every good part of me was a waste, and I believed you, and I put those parts away one by one to make you happy. And it never made you happy. It just gave you more of me to throw away. He stood up. I'm not blaming you for all of it. I let it happen. That's on me. But I'm not doing it anymore. Not for you, not for anybody. And Sophie is going to grow up watching her father be a whole person. That's the thing I can give her that matters most. He picked up the manila folder. He didn't open it. He just slid it across the table back to Lauren. Burn it, he said. Or don't. But we both know you're not going to use it. And he walked out of the coffee shop on 5th into the cold night air, and he did not look back, and his hands were not shaking. He drove straight to the studio. It was after 9, but the light was still on up on the 3rd floor. And when the freight elevator rattled open, Emily was standing there waiting for him, having watched for his truck from the window, and she read the answer off his face before his hands could even move. She's not going to do it. Emily signed half question, half certainty. She's not going to do it, Ryan confirmed. And Emily crossed the studio and put her arms around him, and Ryan Walker held her in the middle of all those loud, silent paintings, and he felt himself shake. Not with fear now, but with the release of it, the terror of the last 6 hours finally draining out of him. And Emily held on and did not let go. And he understood that he was being held by someone who had spent a lifetime learning that presence mattered more than words. They stood like that for a long time. When they finally broke apart, Emily kept her hands on his arms, and she looked up at him, and she signed something slowly. "I need to tell you something," she signed. "And I've been afraid to, because every time I've said it in the past, it's been the thing that made someone leave." Ryan went still. "Tell me." Emily took a breath. "I don't want to be someone's inspiration," she signed. "I told you that the first night, and I meant it, and I've been watching you, Ryan, watching you fall into my world, watching Sophie learn to sign, watching all of it. And I have this fear, this old ugly fear, that you like the idea of me, the brave deaf artist, the special project, the woman you can rescue the way you rescued that boy in the hospital." Her hands trembled. "I've been that to people before. The good deed, and I can't survive it again. So I have to ask you, and I need you to tell me the truth even if it hurts. Is that what I am to you? A person to save?" And Ryan Walker looked at this woman, this fierce, brilliant, frightened woman who had walked into a room built to break her and walked out having saved him, and he understood the enormous courage it had taken her to ask. He didn't answer right away. He wanted to get it exactly right. "When I met you," he signed slowly, "I was the one drowning. Not you. You want the truth. You didn't need saving that night. I did. And you did it. You looked at me across that table, and you reminded me I was a person. You saved me, Emily, not the other way around." He paused. "I don't think you're brave. I mean, you are, but that's not what I see. I don't think you're an inspiration. I don't think you're a project or a good deed or a special anything." His hands slowed and steadied, and he made sure she could see every word. "I think you're the smartest, funniest, most alive person I've ever met. I think you see the world in a way that makes me want to see it that way too. And I think I'm falling in love with you, and it has nothing to do with your ears. It has to do with the fact that you're you." Emily Carter stood very still, and then for the first time since Ryan had known her, she cried. Not the pretty movie kind. The real kind. The kind that shakes your shoulders. The kind you can't hear coming out of yourself when you're deaf, but that racks your whole body anyway. And Ryan pulled her in and held her, and over her shoulder he looked at all her paintings, all that color, all that sound she'd been putting on canvas her whole life so that someone someday might finally see the world the way she did. And he thought, "I see it. I finally see it." When she pulled back, she wiped her face with the heel of her hand, leaving a small streak of blue paint on her cheek, and she laughed at herself, and she signed shaky, Okay. Good. Because I'm falling in love with you too, and it would have been very embarrassing if you'd said no." And Ryan Walker laughed and reached out and gently wiped the blue paint from her cheek with his thumb, the way he'd noticed the fleck under her fingernail that very first night. And he thought about how strange it was. How impossibly strange that the cruelest thing anyone had ever done to him had led him here to this room, to this woman, to this moment. Lauren had wanted to show a room full of people that Ryan Walker was broken. Instead, she had accidentally handed him back his whole life. Winter came, and with it a stretch of months that Ryan Walker would later think of as the time his life quietly reassembled itself into something he recognized. Emily became a fixture at the little apartment. Not all at once, they were still careful, still slow, but steadily, the way a season changes. She'd come by on Sunday afternoons and paint at the kitchen table, while Sophie did homework beside her, the two of them signing back and forth. And Ryan would cook, and the apartment that had felt like a waiting room for 11 months started to feel like a home again. Emily taught Sophie to see color the way she did. Ryan taught Emily how to make his grandmother's chili standing behind her at the stove, guiding her hands, and she laughed at how seriously he took it, and he told her his grandmother would have haunted him if he'd made it wrong. "Daddy," Sophie announced one Sunday apropos of nothing, her hands and mouth working together the way they did now. "I think Emily should live here." Ryan nearly dropped the wooden spoon. Emily, reading the girl's lips, went still. "Soph," Ryan started. "She's here all the time anyway," Sophie reasoned with the pitiless logic of a 6-year-old. "And she has to drive home in the dark, and I don't like it. And when she's here, you laugh more. You didn't used to laugh. Now you laugh." She shrugged and went back to her homework, as if she hadn't just detonated something in the middle of the kitchen. Ryan looked at Emily. Emily looked at Ryan, and neither of them knew quite what to say, so Ryan signed carefully. "She's 6. She thinks everyone she loves should live in one house. She wants Sal to live here too." "I know," Emily signed back. But there was a look on her face, something soft and frightened and hopeful all at once, and Ryan filed it away and didn't push it, because they were going slow, and slow had never once let him down. It was around then that Ryan did something he hadn't planned, something that started small and grew into the thing that would change more lives than his own. Emily had a show coming up, a real one this time, at a real gallery downtown, her first solo exhibition after years of small studio gatherings. She was terrified. Not of the painting, of the people. "A gallery opening is the worst place in the world for a deaf person," she signed to him one night, pacing her studio. "Everyone's talking, fast, over each other, wine and small talk in a crowded room, and I'm supposed to stand there and network and sell my work, and I can't follow a single conversation. I'll smile and nod and have no idea what anyone's saying. And the whole night everyone will be looking at the paintings and talking about the tragic deaf artist instead of the art." She stopped pacing. "I've done it before. I hate it. I always leave feeling like a prop at my own show." Ryan watched her, and something turned over in his mind. "What if you didn't have to?" he signed. "Didn't have to what? Follow every conversation alone. What if there was someone there whose whole job was to make sure you never missed a word? An interpreter, but yours. Someone who stands with you and makes the whole room accessible so you can just be the artist." Emily gave a tired smile. "Professional interpreters cost money I don't have, and they're strangers. It's awkward having a stranger voice your words all night." And Ryan Walker looked at her, and he lifted his hands and he signed, "I'm not a stranger." Emily stopped. "Let me do it," he signed. "You're opening. Let me be your interpreter. I'll stand next to you the whole night. Anybody talks to you, I voice it. You sign your answer, I speak it. You never miss a word. You never smile and nod. You never feel like a prop. It's your night. Let me make sure you actually get to have it." Emily stared at him for a long moment. "You'd do that," she signed. "You'd stand next to me all night and be my voice." "I'd be honored to," Ryan signed. "It's the thing I'm best at in the whole world. I just forgot that for a while." And Emily Carter crossed the room and kissed him for the first time right there in the middle of all her paintings, and Ryan Walker kissed her back. And somewhere in his chest, a door that had been shut for years swung all the way open and stayed that way. The night of the opening, Ryan wore the one good jacket, the same one he'd worn to Bellamy's, and he stood beside Emily as the gallery filled up, and he did exactly what he'd promised. He was her voice. When a critic from the Arts Weekly approached and started asking about her use of color, Ryan translated Emily's signed answer in real time, matching her cadence, her wit, her precision, so that the critic wasn't talking to a translator, he was talking to Emily, fully, completely, as if the language barrier had simply dissolved. When a collector asked what a particular blue and gold canvas meant, Ryan voiced Emily's reply. "It's the sound of a subway train coming into the station. You feel it before you see it. The whole platform hums. That's what that painting is." And the collector's face changed, opened, and he bought the piece on the spot. Nobody that night talked about the tragic deaf artist. They talked about the work. Because Emily, freed from the exhausting labor of trying to survive the room, was luminous. She was funny and sharp and passionate about her own art, and for the first time at one of her own shows, the people around her got to meet the actual person instead of the idea of her. Ryan watched it happen. He stood a half step behind her, voicing her words, and he watched this woman he loved finally fully occupy a room that had always tried to shrink her, and he thought his heart might crack straight down the middle from the pride of it. And someone else was watching too. Ryan didn't notice her at first. There were too many people. But near the end of the night, as the crowd thinned, a woman he didn't know approached 50s, well-dressed with the composed authority of someone used to being listened to, and she waited politely until there was a pause, and then she addressed Emily directly, looking right at her. "Your work is extraordinary," the woman said, slow and clear so Emily could read her. "But I have to tell you what I've been watching all night is almost as extraordinary as the paintings." Ryan voiced Emily's signed reply. "Thank you." "What do you mean?" The woman gestured between the two of them. "This. Him. What he's doing for you tonight. I've been to 100 openings and I've never seen anything like it." She turned to Ryan. "You're an interpreter." "No, ma'am," Ryan said. I learned in the Navy. Signing. To help some men who'd lost their hearing. It's not a job, it's just something I know how to do." The woman's eyebrows went up. "The Navy." "Yes, ma'am." "You learned American Sign Language in the military, to help deaf and hard-of-hearing veterans communicate." "That's right." The woman was quiet for a moment, studying him with an intensity that made Ryan straighten up. Then she reached into her bag and produced a card. "My name is Diane Holloway," she said. "I run a foundation that works with disabled veterans. Reintegration Mental Health Communication Access. And I have been trying for 3 years to build a program that pairs hearing-impaired vets with people who can actually communicate with them. Not clinicians, not strangers. People who understand both worlds, the military and the deaf community." She held out the card. "Do you have any idea how rare you are? A veteran who's fluent in ASL, who learned it in service, who understands what these men have been through. I have been looking for you for 3 years, and I didn't know your name until tonight." Ryan took the card slowly. He looked at it. He looked at Emily, who had followed the whole exchange off the woman's lips and Ryan's face, and whose eyes were shining. "I don't," Ryan started. "Ma'am, I work at a warehouse. I've got a second job. I've got a little girl. I don't know if I have time to—" "I'm not asking you to volunteer," Diane Holloway said. "I'm offering you a job, a real one, coordinating communication access for veterans training others, building the program I've been trying to build for years. It pays. It pays well enough that you could quit that second job, and it would mean spending your days doing the one thing you just told me you're best at in the whole world." She smiled. "I heard you say that to her, earlier. It's the thing I'm best at. I just forgot that for a while." Ryan stood in the middle of the gallery holding the card, and he could not speak. For 11 months he had been a man surviving. Warehouse to second job to home. A body moving through days, keeping his daughter fed and telling himself that was enough. That was all a man like him got to have. He'd buried the best part of himself so deep he'd forgotten it was there, and it had taken a cruel joke at a restaurant and a deaf artist with paint under her fingernail and his own 6-year-old learning to sign to dig it back up. And now a stranger was standing in front of him, offering to pay him to be exactly who he was. He looked at Emily. Emily lifted her hands and signed, so only he would understand, small and fierce and certain, say yes. Ryan turned back to Diane Holloway. His voice when it came was rough. "Yes," he said. Yes, I'd like that. I'd like that very much." Deuce. He got the call 2 weeks later, and it was official, and it was real. And Ryan Walker gave notice at both his jobs and walked into a life he'd never once let himself imagine. The work changed everything. He spent his days with men and women who'd come home from war carrying wounds. Nobody could see some deaf from blasts, some deafened slowly, by years of gunfire, all of them cut off, isolated, drowning in the same silence Ryan had watched Marcus nearly drown in all those years ago. And Ryan sat with them. He signed with them. He told the dirty jokes and argued about football and did the thing he'd always known how to do better than anything. He made sure the quiet didn't win. He was good at it. He was so good at it that within 3 months, Diane had him training others, building the very program she'd chased for years. And Ryan Walker, the quiet man they'd all agreed to feel sorry for, the one Lauren had called too damaged to connect with people, turned out to be a man who could reach the unreachable, because he'd been unreachable himself once and knew the way back. He came home lit up. Sophie noticed it. Emily noticed it. He'd walk in the door and tell them about a vet named Terrence who'd said his first full sentence in sign that day, or about a woman named Grace who'd wept when Ryan told her in her own language that she wasn't broken, she was just waiting for someone to learn how to hear her. "You found it." Emily signed to him one night watching him tell one of these stories over dinner, Sophie fast asleep in the next room. "Found what?" "The thing that was always yours. The thing she told you to bury." Emily's hands slowed. "I watch you now, and I think this is who you were the whole time." She just kept the lid on. Ryan reached across the table and took her paint-stained hands in his. "You took the lid off," he said, "and signed it too, so it counted twice. You and Soph. I want you to know that. Whatever this life turns into, I want you to know you're the ones who gave it back to me." Lauren heard about all of it, of course. In a city that size, with the friends they still half-shared, word got around. Ryan's new job. The foundation. Emily's gallery show that had sold nearly every piece. The picture of the three of them, Ryan, Emily, and Sophie, that had run in the Arts Weekly, alongside a profile of the extraordinary deaf artist and the veteran who'd stood beside her as her voice. She called him one evening in early spring. Ryan almost didn't answer. But he did, because he'd promised himself that anything to do with Sophie, he'd always pick up. "Ryan?" Her voice was strange, quiet in a way he'd rarely heard from her. "I saw the article. The one about Emily. And you." "Okay," Ryan said carefully. "I just—" There was a long pause. He could hear her breathing. "I need to say something. And I need you to just let me say it and not make it into a thing. I'm listening." "That night," Lauren said, "at the restaurant, what I did." Her voice cracked. "I've had a long time to think about it. And I know what I was trying to do. I wanted to embarrass you. I wanted everyone to see the version of you I'd been telling them about, because if they saw it, then it was true. And if it was true, then leaving you was the right thing. And I wasn't the—" She stopped. "I wasn't the bad guy." Ryan said nothing. He let her get there herself. "But I watched you sign to her," Lauren went on, and now she was crying. He could hear it. "I watched you stand up and sign to that woman like it was the most natural thing in the world. And Ryan, I felt sick. Not because you humiliated me, because I finally understood what I'd thrown away. You had this whole world inside you, this beautiful thing, and you tried to show it to me years ago, and I told you it was a waste. I called it a waste. Do you remember?" "I remember," Ryan said softly. "I've thought about that every day since that restaurant," Lauren said. "Every single day. The way I used to watch you sign to yourself at the kitchen table and roll my eyes. God, Ryan, what kind of person does that? What kind of person takes the best thing about someone and tells them to put it away?" Ryan stood in his kitchen. A different kitchen now, a warmer one with Emily's paintings on the walls and Sophie's drawings on the fridge, and he found that he felt no urge to twist the knife. He'd waited a long time in some buried part of himself to hear Lauren admit what she'd done. And now that she was, he was surprised to find that it didn't feel like winning. It just felt like an old wound finally getting some air. "Lauren," he said, "thank you for saying that. It means something. It really does." "I'm not calling to get anything from you," she said quickly. "I don't want anything. I just needed you to know that I know what I did. And I'm sorry. Not the fake kind. The real kind." A pause. "And I'm glad you're happy. I know I don't have the right to be glad, but I am." "You have the right," Ryan said. "You're Sophie's mom. You'll always have some rights with me. Let's try to do better by her, both of us. That's all I want." There was a silence, and then Lauren said very quietly, "She talks with her hands now. Sophie, when she's with me. She tried to teach me a word last weekend. Butterfly. I couldn't get it right, and she got so frustrated with me." A wet laugh. "She's so much like you, Ryan. She sees people." I don't know where she got it because God knows it wasn't from me, but she sees people. She got it from both of us, Ryan said gently. The good parts. Kids do that. They take the good parts. After they hung up, Ryan stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then Emily came in, took one look at his face, and signed, Lauren. Lauren. Ryan confirmed. She apologized, a real one, for the restaurant. Emily's eyebrows rose. How do you feel? Ryan thought about it. Lighter, he signed finally. I didn't know I was still carrying it until she took some of it off me. He pulled Emily close. I don't hate her. I stopped a while ago. And now I think I can just let her be a person who made a terrible mistake and is sorry for it. That's all any of us are, really. People who made mistakes and are trying to do better. Emily rested her head against his chest, where she could feel the rumble of his voice, even if she couldn't hear it, and Ryan held her, and outside, the spring came on green and new. There was one more thing Ryan needed to do, and he'd been turning it over in his mind for weeks. He took Sophie to Sal's diner on a Saturday morning, just the two of them, a father-daughter breakfast that had become their tradition. And over pancakes, he asked her a serious question, the way he asked her all serious questions down at her level, looking her in the eye, treating her words like they mattered. Soph, I want to ask you something important, and I want you to tell me the truth, even if the truth is no. Okay? Sophie put down her fork, sensing the weight of it. Okay. How would you feel, Ryan said, if I asked Emily to marry us? Sophie's eyes went enormous. To marry us? That's right. Not just me. Us. Because if I marry Emily, then you get her too. She'd be family. All the way. Forever. Ryan watched his daughter's face carefully. How does that sound to you? And Sophie Walker, 6 years old, put both her small hands up to her mouth, and then she started to cry. Happy crying, the overwhelmed kind, and she flung herself across the booth into her father's arms and signed against his shoulder the word Emily had taught her that first night in the studio. Friend. And then, pulling back, tears streaming, she signed a word Ryan hadn't even known she'd learned. Family. Ryan Walker held his daughter in a cracked vinyl booth at Sal's diner, and Sal watched from behind the counter, pretending he had something in his eye. And Ryan understood that whatever he'd survived, whatever he'd lost, whatever cruelty had been aimed at him on that terrible, wonderful night at Bellamy's, all of it, every bit of it, had led him here. To a daughter who'd learned to say family with her hands. To a woman who'd shown him the world was louder and more beautiful than he'd ever known. To a life he'd been told he was too broken to deserve. He had one more question left to ask, the biggest one, and he already knew with a certainty that filled him up like light exactly what her answer was going to be. He proposed to her at the studio, of course. There was never any question about where. It had to be the place where she'd first let him in, surrounded by all that color, all that sound she'd spent her life putting on canvas. But he didn't do it alone. He brought Sophie. And he brought Sal, who grumbled the whole drive over about being dragged into romantic nonsense, and then wore a tie, the first tie Ryan had ever seen him in. And he brought Marcus, the 19-year-old from the hospital in Germany. Except Marcus wasn't 19 anymore. He was a grown man of 32, with a wife and 2 kids of his own, and when Ryan had tracked him down through the foundation and told him what he was planning, Marcus had gotten on a plane without being asked twice. Because Marcus understood better than almost anyone alive what Ryan Walker's hands had done for a person once. They set it up while Emily was out. Ryan had asked her to give a talk that afternoon at the foundation, a real request, not a ruse. She'd been wanting to speak to the deaf veterans about art as a way through the silence. And while she was gone, Ryan and Sophie and Sal and Marcus turned the studio into something Emily would never forget. Ryan didn't fill it with flowers. He knew her better than that. Emily didn't experience the world the way hearing people did, and a room full of roses would have meant nothing to her. Instead, he did something else. Something that was entirely, completely her language. He took every canvas she'd painted that was still in the studio, dozens of them, the ones that hadn't sold, the ones she kept because they were too personal to let go, and with Marcus and Sal's help, he arranged them. Not randomly. He arranged them the way she'd once described her whole world to him that first night at Sal's diner over cold coffee. He put the deep blues at the bottom, the ones she'd told him were the hum of the floor when a truck goes by. He put the golds up high, the held notes. He built a room that moved from the low frequencies to the high ones, from the bass she felt in her chest to the light she saw with her eyes, so that walking into it would be like walking into the inside of her own mind, the world as she experienced it given back to her, arranged by a man who'd finally learned to see it. And in the center of it all, where she'd stand, Sophie had made a sign, a real sign on poster board in the careful, oversized letters of a 6-year-old decorated with butterflies, because butterfly was the first word she'd ever struggled to learn. It said in Sophie's handwriting, "Will you marry us?" When Emily came back from the foundation exhausted and glowing from the talk and rode the freight elevator up to the 3rd floor and the doors rattled open, she stopped. She stood in the elevator doorway and looked at what Ryan had done, and Ryan watched her understand it. He watched her eyes move across the room, low to high blue to gold, and he watched the exact moment she realized what she was looking at, that he had taken the way she'd described her inner world months ago in a diner and built it that he'd listened so closely to a single conversation that he could reconstruct the architecture of how she experienced being alive. Her hand went to her mouth, and then she saw the sign, Sophie's sign, and Sophie herself standing beneath it in the sparkle dress, vibrating with the effort of keeping a secret for an entire week. And then she saw Ryan in the one good jacket down on one knee, in the middle of the room he'd built out of her own soul. Ryan didn't speak. He didn't voice a word. He signed, because this proposal was going to happen entirely in her language. No translation. No spoken English. Just his hands and her eyes and the space between them. "The first time I saw you," Ryan signed slowly, so she wouldn't miss a single word. "You walked into a room full of people who wanted to laugh at you. And you didn't run. You sat down next to me, and you saved my life without even knowing you were doing it." Emily's shoulders were already shaking. "I was a dead man walking before I met you," Ryan signed. "I'd buried every good part of myself. I thought that was just what happened to men like me. You get older, you get quieter, you get smaller, and one day there's nothing left but the getting through. And then you walked in, and you looked at me. Really looked the way almost nobody ever had, and you reminded me I was still in here." He paused. His own hands were not entirely steady now. "You taught me the world isn't silent. It's full. You taught my daughter to see color. You gave me back the thing Lauren told me to bury, and it turned into a whole new life. Everything good in my world right now, I can trace back to the worst night of my life, the night that was supposed to break me, because that was the night you walked through the door." Sophie beside him was signing along under her breath, mouthing the words because she'd helped him practice this 100 times. "I don't want to be your voice at the gallery," Ryan signed. "I mean, I do. I'll do that forever. But I want more than that. I want to be your voice, and I want you to be mine. I want to make my grandmother's chili with you every Sunday, and I want to argue about which of your paintings goes over the couch. And I want to grow old in a house that's louder than any house full of hearing people, because it'll be full of the two of us, and this kid, and whoever else comes along." He reached into his jacket. He took out the ring. "Emily Carter." Ryan signed, and then because some words a man has to say out loud, even to someone who can't hear them, has to push the air out of his own body and mean it. He spoke roughly. At the same time, his hands moved. "Will you marry us?" For a moment, Emily couldn't sign anything at all. Her hands were up near her face, trembling, and the tears were running down and dropping off her chin, and she was laughing and crying at the same time in that shaking, silent way of hers. And then she got herself together, and she wiped her eyes with the heels of both hands, and she signed her answer, big, clear, unmistakable, so that everyone in the room could read it. Sophie and Sal and Marcus and Ryan all at once. "Yes," Emily signed. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. Now get up off the floor and put that ring on my hand before I change my mind." And Ryan Walker got up off the floor, and he slid the ring onto her paint-stained finger, and Sophie let out a shriek and launched herself at both of them, and Sal blew his nose like a foghorn. And Marcus stood at the back of the room, watching the man who'd once sat by his hospital bed for 3 months. And he thought about all the ways a single person's kindness can echo forward through the years into rooms they'll never even see. Ryan kissed Emily in the middle of the world he'd built out of her paintings, and Sophie wrapped her arms around both their legs, and for a long moment, nobody needed to say anything at all in any language, because some things are complete exactly as they are. They got married in June, a year almost to the week from that night at Bellamy's. It was a small wedding. Emily didn't want a big one, and neither did Ryan, and they'd both had enough of rooms full of people watching them. So they did it in a park on a green afternoon with maybe 40 guests, but a very different 40 than the 40 who'd gathered at that long table to watch a man be humiliated. There was Sal, who'd closed the diner for the day, a thing he hadn't done in 30 years, and who gave Emily away because she'd asked him to, and because her own father had passed a decade back. There was Marcus and his family. There were the veterans from the foundation, a whole cluster of them deaf and hearing both, and the vows were performed entirely in sign and voice at once, so that not a single person present was left out of a single word. Diane Holloway sat in the second row and cried into an expensive handkerchief. Rachel, the young woman from Bellamy's, who'd been the first to cross over, the first to call it the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, was there too, because Emily had tracked her down and invited her, and she and Emily had become real friends in the year between. And Sophie was the flower girl, of course, in a dress she'd chosen herself, and she signed the whole ceremony, along with the officiant under her breath, her small hands keeping perfect time. Ryan wrote his vows in sign. He'd been practicing for weeks, and when the moment came, he stood in front of Emily under the June sky, and he lifted his hands, and he told her in the language that had brought them together everything he'd never been able to say to anyone in his whole quiet life. He told her she'd found him at the bottom of himself and stayed until he climbed back up. He told her that loving her had made him better at everything, a better father, a better man, better at the work, better at being alive. He told her that the day she walked into Bellamy's was the day his real life started, and that he would spend the rest of it making sure she never again felt like a prop in someone else's story, because she was the whole story. She'd always been the whole story. He'd just been lucky enough to be standing there when she walked in. Emily's vows undid him completely. I spent my whole life. She signed, her hands sure and steady, even as her face crumpled, believing that the best I could hope for was to be tolerated, to be the exception, the one people were nice to, so they could feel good about themselves. I built walls you cannot imagine, Ryan Walker. I decided a long time ago that it was safer to be alone than to be someone's good deed. She paused and looked at Sophie and then back at Ryan. And then you stood up in a restaurant full of people who wanted to laugh at me, and you signed, I'm glad you came, and every wall I ever built fell down at the same time. Her hand slowed. You never once made me feel like a project. You made me feel like the most interesting person in every room. You taught your daughter my language so I'd never be alone in my own home. You built me a room out of my own paintings so I'd know that you'd been listening, really listening the whole time. She was crying now, and so was half the park. People think being deaf means living in silence. Emily signed. It doesn't. My world was never silent, but it was lonely for a long, long time. And you ended that, not by fixing me, not by rescuing me, by walking into my world and learning to live there. So yes, Ryan, I'll be your voice, and I'll let you be mine, for the rest of our lives, because a marriage isn't two people who can hear each other. It's two people who choose every single day to listen. There wasn't a dry eye in the place. Sal wept openly, all pretense of the gruff diner owner abandoned. Marcus held his own wife's hand and thought about a hospital bed a lifetime ago. And Sophie, 6 years old, stood between the two people she loved most in the world and signed to no one and everyone the word family over and over because she couldn't stop. They kissed. Everyone cheered, some out loud, some with their hands raised and fluttering the deaf community's applause, a whole field of waving hands catching the June light, and Ryan Walker looked out over that field of raised hands and thought his heart would burst. Duh. Lauren wasn't there. Ryan hadn't invited her, and she hadn't expected to be invited, and there was no bitterness in it either way. But she sent something, a card, and with it a small wrapped gift. Ryan opened it the night after the wedding alone in the quiet, while Emily put Sophie to bed. Inside the card in Lauren's handwriting were just a few lines. She wrote that she was happy for him, that she meant it, that she'd spent a long time being the kind of person who couldn't be happy for anyone else, and that she was trying to become someone different, and that watching what had happened to Ryan over the past year had shown her it was possible for a person to change. She wrote that she was sorry one more time, not because she needed him to forgive her, but because she needed to keep saying it until she believed she'd earned the right to stop. And she wrote one last line that Ryan read 3 times. "You were never the broken one. I just needed you to be, so I didn't have to look at myself. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what everyone in that restaurant saw that night." The gift was a photograph framed. Ryan didn't recognize it at first, and then he did, and his breath caught. It was a picture from years ago, back when they were still married. He didn't even remember it being taken. He was at the kitchen table, and his hands were up mid-sign, practicing the way he used to, and on his face was an expression Lauren had apparently captured, without his knowing, a look of pure, uncomplicated joy, a man doing the thing he loved. It was the expression she'd spent 8 years telling him was a waste, and she'd kept the photograph all this time. On the back, she'd written, "This was always the real you. I'm sorry I asked you to hide him." Ryan sat with that photograph for a long time. When Emily came out of Sophie's room, she found him holding it, and she sat down beside him and looked at it, and he told her what it was, and where it came from, and what Lauren had written on the back. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she signed, "Are you okay?" And Ryan considered the question honestly, the way he considered everything now. "Yeah," he signed. "I think I am. I think you know what the strangest part is? I don't feel like I won, and I thought I would. For a long time in the back of my head, I thought if Lauren ever admitted what she did, if she ever said she was sorry, I'd feel like I'd finally won something." He looked at the photograph. "But I don't feel like a winner, I just feel free. Those are different things. I didn't know they were different until right now." Emily took the photograph from him gently and looked at the face of the young man in it, mid-sign, joyful, alive. "He's still in there," she signed. "That man, he's not a photograph, he's sitting right next to me." "He's better now," Ryan signed. "Older, been through some things, but better." Emily set the photograph on the mantel in the center, where they'd see it every day. And it stayed there for the rest of their lives, not as a monument to what Lauren had done, but as a reminder of what Ryan had almost lost and found again. A man's true self, mid-sentence, in a language most people never bothered to learn. 10. The years went on the way years do, and they were good ones. The foundation grew. Under Ryan's coordination, it expanded to 3 cities, then 5, then a dozen, a national program pairing deaf and hard-of-hearing veterans with people who could actually reach them. Ryan trained the trainers. He testified before a Senate subcommittee once in Sign and Voice, both about the isolation that killed more veterans than most people knew, and about how the cure for isolation was never a pill or a program, but simply another human being willing to learn your language. Grown men wept in that hearing room. Ryan Walker, who'd once stood silent in the corner of a party for 3 hours, had become a man whose voice, spoken and signed, moved rooms full of the most powerful people in the country. Emily's work found its audience. Her paintings hung in galleries across the country, then in a museum, then in 2. Critics who'd once been tempted to write about the tragic deaf artist learned quickly that there was nothing tragic about her, and everything ferocious, and they wrote instead about the work the sound made visible, the world of vibration and color and light that most people walked through their whole lives without ever noticing. She became known, not as an inspiration, as an artist. It was the only thing she'd ever wanted, and she'd gotten it on her own terms, and Ryan stood at every single opening as her voice a half step behind, beaming the proudest man in any room. Sophie grew up bilingual in a way most kids never are: fluent in English and fluent in sign, moving between the hearing world and the deaf world as easily as breathing. She grew up watching her father reach the unreachable and her mother make the invisible visible, and it marked her. When people asked the teenage Sophie what she wanted to be, she'd say, without hesitation, that she wanted to help people who felt alone stop feeling alone. She'd learned that from both of them. She'd learned it in a diner booth and a paint-splattered studio and a kitchen full of Sunday chili. She grew up knowing in her bones the thing it had taken her father 36 years and a public humiliation to learn: that the quiet ones are not the weak ones, that silence is not emptiness, and that the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply to look at them, really look, and take the time to understand. And on quiet nights, years down the road, Ryan and Emily would sometimes sit on the porch of the house they'd bought together. A house that was, as promised, louder than any house full of hearing people, full of the rumble of Ryan's voice and the flutter of 4 hands talking, and the thump of Sophie's music through the floor that Emily felt in her chest. And they'd talk about that night, the night at Bellamy's, the cruel joke that was supposed to be the end of Ryan Walker. Do you ever think about what would have happened? Emily signed one such night if you hadn't stood up, if you'd just done what she wanted, sat there and been embarrassed, failed the way she planned. Ryan thought about it. He always thought about her questions before he answered. It was one of the 1,000 small ways he loved her. "I think about it," he signed. "I think I'd have gone home that night and gone back to just surviving. Warehouse second job bed. I'd have kept getting smaller. And I never would have known what I was missing, because that's the thing about getting smaller. You forget there was ever more of you." He reached over and took her hand. "She thought she was ending me that night. And in a way she was. She ended the version of me that was disappearing. She just didn't know she was doing me the biggest favor of my life." Emily smiled. "You should send her a thank you card." "I did, actually." Ryan signed, and Emily's eyebrows shot up. "Years ago, after Sophie's graduation from middle school. Lauren came, we all sat together, it was fine. And afterward, I wrote her a card that just said, 'Thank you for that night at the restaurant. You reminded me who I was before I forgot. I hope you found your way back to yourself, too.'" "What did she say?" "She never wrote back," Ryan signed. "But she framed it. Sophie told me. Lauren keeps it on her desk." He shrugged. "People find their way, or they don't. But I stopped needing her too a long time ago. That's the freedom part. You stop needing the people who hurt you to become anything at all. They just become people. Small, ordinary people who did a bad thing once, and you're not carrying it anymore." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder where she could feel the low rumble of his breathing, and they sat in the loud quiet of their porch, and the night came down soft and warm around them. There's a thing that happens sometimes when you tell a story like this one. People hear it, and they want the villain to be destroyed. They want Lauren to lose everything, to end up alone and miserable, to get exactly what she deserved. And there's a part of all of us that understands that hunger, that wants the scales balanced with a heavy hand. But that's not what happened, and that's not the point. Because Ryan Walker's revenge, the only revenge he ever took, the only one that ever mattered, was simply to become the fullest, truest, most alive version of himself, and to build a life so good that Lauren's cruelty became nothing more than the accident of its beginning. He didn't beat her. He didn't need to. He just walked out of that restaurant a year before his real life started, and he never once looked back to check whether she was suffering, because he was too busy living. The joke that was supposed to break him gave him everything. A wife who saw the world in colors he'd never imagined. A daughter who grew up speaking 2 languages and helping the lonely. A calling that saved lives. A self he'd buried and dug back up. Lauren had reached into the whole city, looking for a way to humiliate a quiet man, and she'd accidentally reached past every possibility and pulled out the one woman on earth who could give him back his soul. And so the lesson of that night at Bellamy's, the lesson every person at that long table eventually learned, some of them. That very evening, some of them years later, when they heard how it all turned out, was the simplest and oldest lesson there is, and the one people forget the fastest. Never mistake a quiet man for a weak one. Never assume the silent one has nothing to say. Never look at a person the world has decided to underestimate, the quiet veteran, the deaf artist, the single father working 2 jobs, the woman everyone talks over, and think you know their story before you've taken the time to listen. Because the person everyone laughs at is so often the person with the most powerful thing to say. They're just waiting. Waiting for one person in a room full of people who want to stand up and look them in the eye and speak to them in their own language. Ryan Walker stood up that night, and a quiet man's hands moving in a language his ex-wife had called a waste, said the truest thing that room had ever heard, that no one, no matter how loud the crowd or how cruel the joke gets, to decide the worth of a human being except that human being himself. He was never the broken one. He was the strongest man in the room the whole time, and he spent the rest of his life proving it, not with anger, not with revenge, but with a life so full, so loud, so completely and unapologetically his own, that the silence they'd tried to shame him with became the very thing that set him free.